Hello YouTube, this is Morgan, Airspeed Prime here with my next Avatar news update video. This one is going to be all about information that we got from the Comic-Con Metapod, this podcast here, that just came out today. So this is from Hector Navarro, who I think we've seen do podcasts in relation to, Avatar Nickelodeon stuff before. And the main thing here is that it's a bunch of Avatar related interviews. So Janet Varney, Dante Basco, okay, Jeremy Zuckerman, but then the big one here, Mike and Bryan on this. And the thing here is that this is a full 45-minute thing. And it's basically all about Avatar Studios. So they do pretty consistently talk for a full 40-ish minutes about Avatar Studios. Openly, it's not tons of new information, but it clarifies a lot of the sort of things that we're talking about where we are right now. They don't go into stuff about the, movies, what they are or anything like that. But there's some interesting stuff in here. So I'll definitely say I recommend listening to this. At the very least, open it up, skip to an hour in, and listen to the Mike and Bryan part. I don't think you need to listen to the Janet Varney and Dante Basco one because they have a podcast of their own, and they're obviously not, for the most part, not really insiders on the Avatar Studios stuff. And even if they are, they're probably the worst people to go about, trying to get Avatar Studios information out of, because they are so clearly the hosts of that podcast. That's where they're being positioned right now. So there's no real information there. The Jeremy Zuckerman bit is fine, but they cover actually the main topic of interest much more later on, that being the soundtrack. So let's just get into it here. I've taken a few notes. So let me just go through this here. So the first thing I just noted was right at the start. Basically, Jeremy Zuckerman was asked about his involvement in this. And he just clarified that he's sort of informally involved in it. He basically just kind of covers the idea of oh, well, of course I'm involved because I'm really close with Mike and Bryan. But he mentioned, I think, something along the lines of he hasn't signed the contract yet. But we basically know he's a part of Avatar Studios, and he basically alludes to the idea of it's pretty locked in that he's going to be doing the music on most of this stuff. So, that's pretty clear. He gets asked straight away about what are the chances of the official soundtrack release. It's been so long. Everyone's been asking about it. Is it happening? The main thing he says is that now is the best it has ever looked by a long shot. Jeremy Zuckerman even mentions the fact that fans get frustrated when he talks about this and says the latest sort of vague statement about where the soundtrack progress is. But he does clarify right now is the best it has ever looked. Stuff is happening in relation to the soundtrack. That's the kind of main takeaway here. Beyond that, the Jeremy Zuckerman bit is mostly, the host, just trying to say what's your favorite part of music from this? What type of music would you like to do going forward? And Jeremy Zuckerman's a little hesitant to, overly speculate, because obviously he technically is, I suppose, working on upcoming content. So most of this stuff is definitely from the Mike and Bryan segment, which, like I said, starts about just over an hour in. So first question is, how did Avatar Studios start? So I like that straight away. It's just, oh yeah, we don't really actually know this full story about this. And so basically Mike says that, shortly after they left the live action Netflix show, Bryan sort of alludes to the idea of oh yeah, Mike made it all happen. So clearly Mike was aware that Nickelodeon had new kind of high-ups. They mention Ramsey Naito and Brian Robbins, who obviously we've heard stuff about before, as the new heads of Nick Animation and stuff like that. So they kind of allude to the idea of almost at the same time, Mike kind of in a way trying to contact them contacting him. And more or less he says, he asked the question, why don't we just oversee everything Avatar related? And that's sort of how it came about. Bryan goes on to sort of explain a little bit more clearly that Brian Robbins was okay, let's do something. And he says, think big. And Mike's first suggestion was, what about our own studio? And he actually agreed to it. So a little bit of a fun thing about just, I suppose, how this actually did come about, and that Mike was the one to sort of, in a way, bring up the whole bigger franchise style thing. So that's kind of cool. Then there's more general stuff as you go through about how, they again highlight the difference between back then working on ATLA especially, but I suppose also on Korra to a degree, and how different things are at Nick now because of how much the whole scene has evolved, and how differently, I suppose, Avatar is perceived. That back then, Avatar was the weird outlier show, like, that has all this like continuity and stuff like that. It felt very different compared to anything else that they have there. Now, everyone, like even the high ups, are aware that there's a demand for a sort of like franchise continuity and for everything to sort of be connected, and that they have this show that is connected, Avatar and Korra, and that if they commit to that, they can have something really, really amazing on their hands. So Avatar has managed to sort of work its way to being the prime thing that, in a way, they need, Nickelodeon. So from a business point of view, it really highlights, how significant Avatar is. That, like, yeah, it's exactly what they need in terms of, like, it's all about streaming nowadays. So content, and what better way to do that than a show that has vast lore, vast continuity to it. They mention at one point the sort of idea of their roles in a way with Avatar Studios, and what's happening is that they are setting the stage and creating these sandboxes and getting in people to play in those sandboxes. That's the way, I suppose, that they want to do things, in the sense that they're in an overall overseer role and will play a role, I suppose, in every project, but they won't be directly the ones directing every single project. As we know, Laura Montgomery is the director on the first movie. They don't mention her like specifically in this interview, but that seems to be the idea. That they do again bring up at times, Bryan especially, the idea that he talks through the whole idea of, like, Avatar was their first idea, but they were thinking about the grander scheme things of, like, the Wan origin story was sort of pseudo in place early on, but they told it in Korra. That Korra was something that they wanted to do second, because they like to do some things that are different. And so I think that's why this is working in this way, where we're going to be able to get the things that are more what fans want, because Bryan isn't going to have to spend, every hour of every day on the ATLA continuation movie or something like that maybe doesn't creatively interest him as much, but he can still, like, assist on, because he's going to be designing this new stuff that he's super interested in. So helps you to understand, I suppose, the situation that Avatar Studios is in now compared to what it was before. And I basically brought this up before, of like, when Korra happened, it's like they've got this one show. They don't know if they're ever going to get anything else. They wanted to do something different than Avatar. Now they have all the shows that they want, basically. They've got time. They can do a little bit of everything, and that's sort of what they allude to here. Then, let's get into animation here. So, an hour 15 or so in, if you want to listen to this part specifically. So, they bring up the whole 2D, 3D thing. And Bryan actually jumps straight in on this, and is sort of like, he basically has seen the sort of dramatic reaction from a lot of people, that people freaking out that it looked like it was going to be 3D, because again, it was Brian Robbins who said it was 3D. So, like, it's not fans like overly freaking out about this, because CG was mentioned as one of the first things about it, and then the whole Arcane Spider-Verse dynamic got brought up. So what he clarifies here is that, okay, they're going to be doing all sorts of things, but 2D is always going to be their bread and butter. That's what he says, literally word for word. 2D is their bread and butter. And effectively that the technology will be there to help and enhance the cinematography and stuff like that. The thought process is a little scattered as he goes through this, but you can see the idea is that instead of maybe what we thought it was, which was that they're doing 3D, but they're stylizing it to make it look 2D. it almost seems like it's going to be the other way, where it's going to be 2D with technology to, I suppose, make it better and easier to do. That seems to be what I take from this. But the overall takeaway would definitely be, for the main big project, so for sure the movies, they seem to be suggesting it's going to be 2D. Now, it might be they still talk about the whole idea of they're working hard to form their own look. So they're trying to sort of, in a way, I guess, create more of an Avatar studio style. He didn't lean into it too much about what exactly that means, but it's probably just highlighting that it is going to be a unique blend, but that it is mostly 2D. That it is. So I think you guys should listen to this in full to see what he says, but the takeaway from it is that the main projects are going to be primarily 2D with some technology to assist it. So we'll see what exactly that means. He directly references Arcane Spider-Verse and sort of highlights that they are not trying to do that. They're not trying to just do those styles. Now, I think a lot of times when people bring up Arcane Spider-Verse, they more mean the general idea of 3D with sort of a look of 2D to it. Whereas I think Bryan maybe more was talking here about, we're not trying to do those exact styles of those two shows, the way they look. So take from that sort of what you will. I think twice in what he says they are not, at least in their big projects, none of the big projects at the moment are going to be done in 3D. Not doing anything purely in 3D at the moment. So it's a weird one because of the wording of, like, we're not doing anything entirely 3D. But again, it's highlighting that even in most animations these days, 3D is still used in specific shots and in general. 3D is a part of 2D animation. That's just the way it is. But the fear that we're leaning very heavily into 3D seems to be completely taken away based on what I would take from this. That's my interpretation of it anyway. They talk about how they can better plan with what they have going on with Avatar Studios, the start, middle, and end. They don't have as much of a worry as they did during Avatar and Korra about not being confirmed for enough seasons. So they bring up the whole idea of that if ATLA went the wrong way, it would have been over 13 episodes in, because that's all they were like fully confirmed for right at the beginning. But they got eventually confirmed for the rest of it after that. And then they bring up the whole Korra situation of, like, it was 1 season initially, then we know it was 2, but then it quickly expanded out into 4. And they talk about that whole idea. They bring up a little bit of the sort of format here of, again, Bryan has said this before, that they prefer, as creators, the 12 to 14 episode season format. And they wanted that. Nickelodeon wanted to do that, and they also agreed that they wanted to do that. So that's a very interesting thing of, like, they actually didn't necessarily want the full, 20 episode Aang thing, because they talk about how they like changing up the format. They like doing things differently. And that seems to be the general Avatar Studios approach here of, they're going to be doing a lot of different stuff with format, tones. That's the main thing in a lot of their interviews that they've talked about, is there's going to be a variety to what's going on here. About an hour 22 in the podcast, they bring up the idea of novels and comics. So the first thing with the novels that Mike mentioned, that there was no exhaustive history for Kyoshi planned out ahead of times. So it wasn't the case where just, say, the Rise of Kyoshi is just sort of like 70% the series Bible on Kyoshi. That he basically says there's, like, more or less, there's only like a basic skeleton of, like, yeah, Kyoshi goes from here to here. And that FCE was instrumental in fleshing out that story into what it actually is. So that's the sort of stuff that I do always find interesting in terms of, like, referencing the idea of, like, okay, Kyoshi's referenced quite early on in Avatar, and she has little bits and pieces, but how many of the gaps are actually filled in the overall series Bible? And the answer obviously was not really much. So they talk about how there's a more cohesive strategy with Avatar Studios. for comics and novels. And more or less this idea of like to not do certain comics or novels if they know they have a plan for a movie in place. I more or less interpreted this as like, well, I guess that's why the Avatar comics have stopped, because they're obviously going to do a movie that is set somewhere in that comic timeline, and they don't want there to be that overlap of the movie production has to be so careful not to overlap with whatever they're doing with the comic. So just being careful about that. They at this point bring up the idea that they now have a story editor helping them with continuity. Bryan mentions video game during this. It's a little offhanded, like I say, it's not very specific here. He just mentions video game, and it could be referring to the book 2 video game for Korra, but we'll get to that in just a second. Next, Mike mentions that they plan to try and keep everything canon, but some stuff may need to be tweaked. Again, didn't go into too much specifics on this, but this was effectively in response to the podcast host asking the question of, in a way, like, how strict are you going to be about the fact that there's a lot of information out there from, say, the novels or the graphic novels, the comics, and are you going to basically... This sort of leads to the adaptation thing, which I'll get to in a second, of, is it going to make the comics like legends, and you'll effectively have like 2 versions of that story, one done as like the movie version, one as the original comic version, and he just mentions that, no, we're going to try and keep everything canon, but some stuff may need to be tweaked. I think alluding to the fact that like he's probably aware that there are like very like obscure sources of information within the fandom that probably is very much like, yeah, you can contradict that. That's very retconnable if you need to. Then we get probably the big one here, one of the main takeaways here. Direct confirmation here. They will not be adapting graphic novels or novels into movies or TV shows. There is no plan at the moment. They do say like it could maybe happen, you know, like the door's open at some point because they have so many options for stories. Could maybe happen, but not now. Bryan, I think it was Mike who says this, and then Bryan also adds on to that. But they are feeding off them. So it's highlighting the idea that I feel what they're saying by that is that they're acknowledging the existence of the comics and the novels. So if the information that the first movie is a Kyoshi movie is correct, I'm assuming my takeaway from that is that they are going to fully utilize the fact that there is now that history of Kyoshi in place in proper material, and that the movie will reference that at will. And it will stem off that. So if you have read those novels, you'll gain an extra appreciation for what's going on in the movie. And similarly, you know, the takeaway here obviously is that this likely means they're not adapting The Search for like the Zuko movie. But it's going to stem off that, I guess, because, you know, realistically, there's only one thing they're probably going to do the Zuko movie about. And so this is good. It's just to know that they're not dismissing the novels, graphic novels, putting them to the side. They're actually like acknowledging them, and they talk about this, you know, with the story editor. They have the plan for these in place now. They're planning to keep everything canon as much as possible. This is a good sign, I think, in terms of just they want to do new content, but utilizing what's already there. So this is good. This helps speculation for these movies a lot, in that it means the Kyoshi thing is not a Rise of Kyoshi or Shadow of Kyoshi adaptation. The Zuko movie, whatever it is not going to be an adaptation of like The Promise, The Search, Smoke and Shadow. The Korra movie, if that's confirmed, is not going to be an adaptation of Turf Wars or Ruins of the Empire. It will be new stuff. That's really good. I like that. It does mean everything is going to be fully new, which is good. Then the podcast host asks Mike and Bryan about the soundtrack release. And what I love about this is that Bryan steps up straight away. Very, very solid yes. They then get into a bit of a discussion, and, you know, they talk about, you know, the complexities of it. But the inherent takeaway from the couple of minutes that they talk about this is that extremely positive about the soundtrack happening, but wanting to make it clear that it has not been officially confirmed to happen yet. There's no release date, there's no like direct, it is a thing that is coming soon, but that in their mind, they have been working on it and trying. So, some of the details here. So many times, so close over the years, but it just sort of fell off. Bryan mentions that one of the first things they mentioned to Brian Robbins, when he asked them that, like, hey, okay, we're doing this now. So we're doing all these projects. What other Avatar stuff do you want to do? One of the first things they said was they want the official soundtrack release. And Brian Robbins seemed like he was up for it as well. Bryan mentioned he's had a few phone calls about it. They are trying hard. It just hasn't fully happened yet. Bryan mentions like basically all the red tape in place that in this case they have to work with like a a record label or whatever. There's probably something going on with the whole idea that I think relatively recently there is going to be like a Nickelodeon record label, and they're just figuring it out. But that, both Jeremy Zuckerman, Bryan primarily, but also Mike, all three of them being like pretty positive that it is like all but confirmed to happen. And we've been waiting for this for many, many years. And I have felt that basically ever since Jeremy Zuckerman has been in any way connected to Avatar Studios, it was going to happen. But now, especially hearing just that the creators were talking about it and that early on in Avatar Studios stuff, this is something that they wanted. And then even just them having this talk about it on the podcast here, it's good for it to be brought up again. So hopefully that can happen sooner rather than later. Especially like say the Korra soundtrack, I feel like that should be something that like can happen without too much issue. Obviously, I think we know the ATLA soundtrack is going to need a little bit more work done on it before a release, but that's where we're at. Randomly, just out of nowhere, Bryan does confirm a bunch of video games in the works, because this is the crazy thing of like outside of the officially announced Avatar Generations, I suppose we now know it as, the mobile game. All the other video game news is effectively insider information. It's not really like full on official that we knew that there were other video games in the works. So Bryan just mentioning that like, oh yeah, there are a bunch of video games in the works is like pretty interesting. Because it's very offhanded. He just immediately after this goes into the whole idea of like, oh yeah, when we're working with Magpie on the RPG. And final point here is that he also mentions they're small things, they're smaller projects that they're doing. They're just as excited about them. Not really clear what exactly that means. I am assuming that probably means the spin-off shows, or more than likely the when they first announced Avatar Studios, the short form content that they were planning to do. And I think this probably ties in with some of what was talked about here, about how the idea of like, specifically, none of the big projects will use 3D. I think suggesting that we might get stuff that is like short form content that's like released on YouTube or something like that, that maybe is done in some sort of a CG 3D style. So actually a rather insightful podcast here. I suppose the final thing I want to just talk about here is where does this maybe leave us as we go into like Comic-Con coming up soon. It's really interesting because like this felt like they were as open as they could be given what news was out. Kind of in a way surprised that they didn't mention that the like confirmed news of like 3 movies. There was definitely a kind of odd sense of that, but I get it. The whole confirmation about what the movies potentially are is not official. So I get why that's, not the case. But what is interesting is that the host of this, at the start of the podcast, when they're just chatting amongst themselves before the interview segments, do bring up what basically the fandom knows about it. So they do get across the idea that the rumored movies are Kyoshi, Zuko, and Korra. So bit interesting that they don't bring it up with Mike, but I suppose if they did, you know, it would be a really awkward maybe situation of like, you know, we basically know what is confirmed, but you can't say it is, and that sort of thing. So will we get news at Comic-Con? I'm really unsure. Part of me wants to be like, they're being much more open about it here. We haven't had anything resembling this since now. The fact that official news did come out a few weeks ago about the 3 movies being confirmed, and then that was followed up by insider information seemingly confirming proper details. Then the behind the scenes things of like, at the place where they gave that information, they showed off a piece of concept art to the press. That makes it feel like they're getting into early marketing mode where they're willing to talk more openly about this. So maybe, I still feel it's maybe a little early, but also like if not now, then New York Comic Con. If not New York Comic Con, then the February event, the investors meeting next year, February. If not then, next Comic Con or what? Because again, the rumor is saying first movie in 2024. So you probably we have to learn about that at the very least a year ahead of time, if not probably like a year and a half, which I think puts like a little bit of a time limit on things of like probably like SDCC 2023. So next year's SDCC is kind of the big one. So at some point effectively between now and a year from now, we do probably need to learn the full details about this. And I think it would be for the best to get that announcement out sooner rather than later. Especially if it is literally just that, hey, it's a Kyoshi movie, like you maybe show a piece of concept art, give a very basic idea about what they're expecting, talk a little bit more about the kind of scope of Avatar Studios and present some ideas about specific things. Because again, they talk about that multi-layered approach, and so it's going to feel weird if when we do get an announcement, it is just the first project, when I think we're expecting to hear about like the first wave, the lineup of shows. So interesting stuff. But yeah, again, I'll have this linked in the description below the podcast if you want to listen to it. But yeah, in the comments, let me know what your thoughts are on this. So I guess to sum it up, the soundtrack about as confirmed as it can be without having a sort of like product listing official announcement. The most positive I think it's ever been about the soundtracks being released. So that's probably the main like takeaway in terms of like just direct like brand new information being confirmed. Really, really interesting. Clarification on the animation, seemingly suggesting that rather than sort of 3D with 2D, it's more 2D with technology, computer stuff to help it. So like the reverse of maybe what we thought. So that's also quite interesting. Big one here, they will not be adapting graphic novels or novels for the movies or TV shows. There are no plans for these initial projects right now to do anything like that. And then I guess the other one would just be the video games being confirmed, multiple being worked on. So what are your thoughts on all of this? Where does this leave us going into sort of the Comic-Con season coming up? But that has been the video. Thanks for watching, and bye.